We're going to begin a series on what's called the Merkavah, and basically it means chariot. I've been asked over the years that I've been teaching Semitic meditation form and from the Torah and stuff about it because it's very popular in Kabbalistic circles, even in Christian mystical circles. It's always been a trepidatious point for me because um, these circles of mysticism, some of them are even called Merkavah mystics. It mostly comes from the first chapter of Ezekiel and his vision. And from the very beginning, the rabbis were nervous about Ezekiel's vision and Ezekiel, and it almost didn't make it into the Tanakh for various reasons. And I don't want to get into all of them. One of them is that the fear that his vision would be taken literally, meaning that, this is where God, because he has a vision of a chariot, and ultimately he claims in his vision, in his book, that this is God on the chariot, right? Yud He Vav He. And if you take that literally, then you're looking at this description in sort of an idolatrous way, because Ein Sof, the divine, can show up in any way it wants, at any time it wants, right? So, and as meditators, especially in the Ablafian tradition, we really need to not put boundaries around that or narratives around that. So that's the biggest thing. There were some other things that the rabbis were concerned about. And, if you know me, it's not that I take up the concerns of the rabbis all the time. But in this case, I think there was maybe some justification for their concerns. Some of the things he says in the book are somewhat contrary to halakha in the actual Torah. Like, for example, he talks about that the sins of the fathers, he says some things that contradict the karmic nature of what's spoken by Moses in the Torah, which is that, our actions are passed down from generation to generation. So that was another big thing where he was like, no, you're just responsible. Your kids aren't responsible. I mean, you could argue that. I don't think it matters to any of us, really, at least at this moment. So it was controversial, the book, to begin with. And another thing that I think is a beautiful thing about Ezekiel is that different than the other prophets, so there was always this sort of thing between prophets and priests, right? It was sort of like the prophets carried this burden of social inequities and the burden of the disenfranchised, and they would contrast that to the ceremonial things in the temple, right? So if you read Isaiah, for example, and others, you'll see, well, your sacrifices don't mean anything to me because you don't feed the homeless or the widows or the orphans. Why do you bother making your sacrifices? So obviously a priest hears that and he spends his whole life making sacrifices. He's saying, well, I don't think that's such a good prophecy, right? So there's these issues, priesthood, prophecies. So Ezekiel is a Zadokite priest who partakes in, and he's a leader in the priesthood, and he partakes in making these sacrifices. But he also is in the school of prophets and becomes a prophet, as you see. And when I say beautiful, I mean, I feel, in my own personal opinion, he bridges that gap where he feels like it doesn't have to be a contradiction. Ceremony is a beautiful thing. And it's something that enables us to have really an inner response, a heart response to God or to the divine in a particular tradition or a particular fashion. It doesn't mean that because there are disenfranchised that we shouldn't do ceremony. But what his feeling is we need to do both. We need to take care of people and we need to be ceremonial as well. And it kind of makes me feel pretty good about it. But we're not going to get into that so much. I'm just giving you the background of Ezekiel. We're going to focus in this series mostly on the first chapter, which is this experience of the Merkavah. So it's translated as chariot most of the time, actually, in the first chapter. He doesn't use the word, but his whole experience has been labeled the Merkavah experience. And there are other chariot experiences in the Tanakh, and in the whole Tanakh itself, many mentions of the chariot of fire that took up Elijah, right, is also a big thing and very much related to these things. But we're not going to, go too far into that. Circling back to what I said about concerns of the rabbis was this idea of being very literal. So all of you have been in these Zoom teachings for a while now, so that's not me. I'm not a literalist when it comes to the Torah or a lot of these teachings. I feel like much of it's allegory, metaphor, but it's all divine instruction. So the divine instruction is what's important, not whether, you could look at the whole Tanakh and say, if you're a literalist, or I don't know, what do they call those guys in the Supreme Court that only take it the way it was written? Originalist. If you take it that way, then everything becomes very rigid and stuck in space and time. I'm not, talking about the Constitution. I'm talking about the Torah. I don't see it that way. I see it as a living instruction. And it's beautiful because it stands the test of time. So when we examine, as we examine over the next few weeks, and I'm going to try to keep each lesson short, in the idea of the TED Talk people not going much over 13 minutes, which means there may be very many of them, because there's a lot to unpack in that first chapter of Ezekiel. So, but we're not going to be literal about it. We're in the Abulafian tradition. Abulafia certainly had nothing bad to say about them. He was a student of Maimonides. Maimonides certainly talked about the Merkavah and Ezekiel's experience as a beautiful mystical experience, but did also caution that it not be taken literally, that this is, because there are groups that seek to have that same vision because they feel that that is exactly the way God sits on that chariot, right? So in their meditations, they do guided meditations and meditations to conjure up that experience. That's not Abulafian meditation or anything that I've ever taught, because we become in our meditations a receiver from that well of being, right? We don't tell the well of being what we want to receive. We have a desire, and then it comes from the well of being to us. Kabish? Good. Okay, so today's lesson is just to establish that platform from which we'll be talking. And another critical piece of this platform is that, so we have an understanding. Ezekiel, this is like 586 before the Common Era, right? So this is a long time ago. Ezekiel is a Zadokite priest in the temple performing these ceremonies in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, decides that he wants to invade Judea and take over. And so this happens in two waves. The first wave, he goes into the temple and takes the leadership. So he takes the priesthood and he takes the king and he marches them off to Babylon. And I copied a little map. So you can imagine this is a turbulent calamity that's happening in Jerusalem, right? You know, we're sitting here nice and free in our country, even though some of us feel we're not totally free. We're still relatively free. Imagine people from another country coming and just taking us, like they did to hostages on 7th. It's really trauma, a lot of trauma. But in all the calamities that we experience in life, and the traumas have the potential of being something very beautiful and special. And that's what happened with Ezekiel. And many scholars will say the whole Babylonian captivity was really an incredible boost spiritually for the Hebrew people. So we can look at that and say it's easier said than done, but when we have our own calamities and traumas, what comes out on the other side, depending on how we handle it, is the opportunity for greatness is there. So basically from Jerusalem, they're taken up through Syria and back to Babylon, which is modern day Iraq, right? And they're living in, so again, this is the first wave. You would say the leadership of the Hebrew people have been taken away from Jerusalem and Judea and now are in what is modern day Iraq, which at the time was Babylon, and living in refugee camps. And interestingly, the first chapter begins with Ezekiel going down to the river. And the name of the river is Chabah, Kaf Bet Resh. And you can see Merkavah, that is the chariot is Merkavah, and Chabah, which is the river, is closely related to the word Merkavah. So there's significance in going down to this river called Chabah, right? So in this study, we're going to be looking at gematria and numerology, Jewish numerology and gematria a little bit, because it's important. And being from the sort of metaphorical side, not the literary side of the whole thing, and everything is, literal, we're going to look at those things and how they relate to our meditations. So as I said, Kaf and Bet have a numerical value of what? 22. Right? So we know that within the context of this chariot experience, and within the context of going down to this river, that number stands out. And as we go into the first chapter more deeply, you'll see that it's clearly a message hard to ignore, that this is about the meditation experience on the 22 letters and the 10 sephira. So if we look at that and say, what's happening here? We have this trauma. We're taken out of our homes and we're now in a foreign land in refugee camps. And Ezekiel, who is a Zadokite priest, goes down to this river, the Chabar River, and he begins what I'm going to say is a process that he describes the experience of, which is a meditative process that brings him to higher states of consciousness. Now, what's going to happen is we're going to learn about this for the purpose of instruction into the possibilities of our own experience, but not in such a way that it has to duplicate that experience. So what I'm going to be doing is comparing this chariot experience with the Sefer Yetzirah, because the Sefer Yetzirah is really a literal book. It's not about metaphors. It's about formation through the energies of sound and light, formation, creation, action. Whereas Ezekiel is a story of an experience, just like Shir HaShirim. So when we read Shir HaShirim, for example, it's a love song, it's a love poem that talks about the experience that the Sefer Yetzirah tells us how we can have, right? So it's like if you read a book on the joy of sex, for example, it used to be a popular book when I was engaged in getting married. Everybody read it. It was a practical book saying, hey, you know what? These are these zones, and this is that zone, and every other thing. So that's like the Sefer Yetzirah. It's a practical book. But the Shir HaShirim is a love story of what happens when you know all the practicalities and you're just in love and you're having that experience. That's what Ezekiel is. So there's no desire on our part to duplicate the exact vision of Ezekiel. But we're going to talk about those visions and those directions and those wheels within wheels and the otiyot related to them and the chayot running and returning that it speaks of in the first chapter and also speaks of in the Sefer Yetzirah. So that's what we'll be doing over the next 5-6 weeks, whatever. But before we meditate, I just wanted to say one last important thing. So this 22 is also the numerical value of Lev, which is what? Heart, right? So this experience, this trauma experience, is one that circumcises the heart. So in the Sefer Yetzirah and other texts, we talk about this central column, and it's within us. So it talks about the circumcision of the tongue, of the heart, and of your private part, right? So this circumcision is in the central column, and it's where we are most vulnerable, okay? And our mystical experiences are about unification. So the word for the river, Chabar, has multiple meanings. And I'll read one from that I had here. Hold on. Chabar, one of the meanings is greatness and also already existing, binding together, joining, braiding, strength and magnitude, abundance. So this binding and joining is part of the experience of the Merkavah at the Chabar River. The binding and joining of something that's getting bigger and is great in abundance, right? Always existed. But now Ezekiel has the experience of it, right? So the experience of binding the conscious thinking level with divine consciousness. There's a binding, there's a unification. It's there already, but it's a binding. But what's necessary is the circumcision. What's necessary is being vulnerable. Because in our tradition, mystical experiences aren't things that just happen in your head. It's not just something that we ponder. In our tradition, if it's spiritual, it's physical too. So being vulnerable in our human existence is a critical thing to having the unification and the joining of the divine. So we don't leave our heart on the side and just have a mental experience. We allow ourselves to be vulnerable in the same way that Ezekiel did. I don't want to have people crashing into my house and bringing me to Mexico or Canada. But I don't need to have that experience. Well, I would go to Mexico to see Jacob, but not by force, right? So we can be, especially in our relationships, our partners, our children, our brothers and sisters, and our mothers, we need to allow our hearts to be circumcised. And we're vulnerable in those relationships. And when we're vulnerable in those relationships, that's when the openness to those experiences become real. And it's a critical point. There's no point in going through this experience if we think it's just an intellectual one or just a mental one. It's about that love that is vulnerable. Okay, so that's just an introduction, and we'll dive right into the first chapter next week. And if there's any questions or things you want to add, maybe now before we meditate.
Just a quick question, because I think Lev, the heart, I don't think it's 22. Isn't it 32? Isn't Lam?
Oh. So let me just talk about that a little further. The Lamed is part of the connection of joining, right? So the joining above and below, it's the tallest letter. It has this thing that sticks up. Thank you for reminding me that. I said 22 because I was stuck on that. It's 32. So it's also completely related to the Sefer Yetzirah, right? Why? Shloshim b'shtayim, right? Shloshim b'shtayim is 32. Netivot, Pliot, Chachma, it's all there. 32 is just the 22 letters and 10 sephirot. So when we discuss how he lays out the month and the year of his vision, which you guys will probably do before the next meeting, so I don't even have to teach next time. But you'll see it's so crazily visible in there. It's so obvious. 32 is obvious, 22 is obvious, 10, 13, all these combinations, they're all there, right? But we'll talk about them next week.